Coffee, the weekly video cast that we've started for, I don't know, probably about 2.5 months now. That was really designed mostly because I was a little bit bored. So I just started calling some friends and interesting people and said, hey, let's get online and talk every Monday for about 30 minutes. And it's really turned into something more important, conversations with people that are doing interesting work about current events, especially the way in which we as individuals and as a community and society are responding to the ongoing challenges of staying safe and sane at a time of COVID, of a worldwide pandemic. Today's guest is Dr. Nathan Stahl, who's a staff geriatrician at Sinai Health System. He received his medical degree from Western University and completed his residency in internal medicine and fellowship training in geriatric medicine at the University of Toronto. He's currently a research fellow at Women's College Research Institute at Women's College Hospital, and is completing a PhD in clinical epidemiology and healthcare research and institute health policy, so forth. And his bio goes on and on and on and on, which is just a very impressive way of saying Dr. Stahl, Nathan, is impressive. Our topic today is a really important one. And I remember, Nathan, when we first started talking about this, you used the words "our national shame," and that really stung with me. And certainly, when we look in the papers and we read what's happened as an outcome of the pandemic, or the way in which we as society have been taking care of our elderly. And also, I think it's 80% of all the COVID deaths are deaths that have happened in nursing homes and assisted living facilities and so forth, which really just exposed a major breakdown in our system. And I think that's what we want to talk about. I've been thinking about that a lot since we first had that conversation. Why don't you tell us? First start with telling us, the details. Describe what has happened and what's been happening in terms of caring for our seniors during this time of COVID.
Yeah, so I did use that term, national shame, and really that refers to the dubious distinction that Canada has of having the highest proportion of our country's COVID-19 deaths out of 15 other OECD countries occur in long-term care homes or nursing homes, or I know this is across the country, so there are different terms for that as well, or care homes as they call in many of the Western provinces. And so Canada is often cited as having a COVID-19 success story because we have effectively managed, for the most part, to quote unquote flatten the curve and not have the catastrophic number of COVID-19 cases and deaths that we see in our community, in our neighbors to the south. While there has been some attention on this national shame of 80% of deaths occurring in long-term care settings, I would argue that a lot of that has actually been forgotten almost since we last spoke, as people are now focused on back to school and other issues that are at the forefront of people's minds. But what happened in our long-term care homes was truly a humanitarian crisis that happened even within homes within our cities, the city that we're talking in, Toronto. And really, it happened in two provinces in our country, which was Ontario and Quebec, which accounted for the overwhelming majority of COVID-19 deaths in our country and the overwhelming majority of COVID-19 deaths in long-term care homes. So about 2,000 of them occurred in Ontario, and close to 5,000 occurred in the province of Quebec. And broadly, as I hope we'll get into, I would still argue that the pandemic, even when it started, and really started, kind of the date I have anchored in my mind as the date that as a sports fan that the NBA shut down, but I think that truthfully triggered a lot of a huge succession of events. If we recall back in March, where the NBA shut down and Sophie Gregoire Trudeau got COVID, and so did a bunch of other notable people. And then quickly, within the spirit of about 48 to 72 hours, society really shut down and we locked down. But I would argue since that time, the way that we have treated older adults and the way we have approached older adults and dealing with older adults and protecting older adults comes primarily from a place of isolation. And really, we haven't figured out a way to protect older adults without isolating them in this pandemic. And I think for a lot of older adults, this is the fear as we move into the fall and the winter, which are expected to be harder months than the summer months have been.
So tell me a little bit more about that. I mean, I remember that day too. The Globe and Mail, the day after, it was like a week of everything shutting down, and ran like a 2-page thing of everything that just kind of stopped. And for me, the date that sticks out is March 13th, which is when, like, the order came to basically stay at home. I know that for us at the synagogue, I struggle with this all the time. It's like, how can I bring people together in a safe way? And I haven't been able to, we at Bethzedik haven't been able to figure out a good way to do that. Tell us more about the problem, and what are some of the ways in which you think society's failing, and what are some of the suggestions that you would have?
Well, one of the good things about the last few months has been, candidly, the warmer weather, and the fact that COVID-19 transmission outdoors is abated to a large degree. And so, you use the word congregation in a synagogue, and congregating is unfortunately the thing we're trying to avoid during a pandemic. And so the very fact that we call places of worship a congregation, which is literally what people are doing, is somewhat antithetical to everything that public health authorities and public health messaging is trying to push forward and propose. So, I think the warmer weather and the fact that people are able to gather outdoors has been helpful for people's mental health, helpful for the resumption of some activities within our economy, helpful for people to actually reconnect with individuals in a safe distance way outdoors. But we have a huge problem which is that we live in Canada. And, what is that going to mean in the fall? What is that going to mean in the winter? And how do we, as we move forward, make sure that the public policy that we're creating and the actions that we're taking includes older adults who are the more vulnerable people during this pandemic, and are not just vulnerable in terms of contracting COVID-19 and having bad outcomes from COVID-19, but they're most vulnerable to the social and economic sanctions, or not sanctions, but restrictions that are being imposed. Activities of daily living that they may need to take on are much more difficult in this pandemic world. The things that we take for granted, like, some people have said, well, COVID-19 has been much more convenient for me. I'm able to have food show up at my door and alcohol delivered to my door, and things we take for granted as being sort of more digitally native, maybe more difficult for older adults. And we really need to make sure that we continue to, the term social distancing has actually been changed months ago to physical distancing, that we maintain physical distance, but maintain social connectivity, particularly for older adults who are already at risk of loneliness and social isolation, and are already at risk of the greatest adverse effects from the collateral damages that they may be incurring from the measures being imposed by public health authorities and by society in general to combat the pandemic.
What are some of those collateral damages?
Yeah, so the most, just like nursing homes experience the most deaths, what we're seeing in nursing homes now is actually a horrific pandemic of loneliness and social isolation. So again, we haven't figured out a way in society to protect them without isolating them. So the response in March in nursing homes was basically to shut the doors and not let anyone in. And gradually in June, they've started to allow really restrictive visiting from a distance. But largely, people who live in nursing homes across our country have been locked in pandemic prisons for the last 6 months. And so, we've seen directly people who have had functional declines, physical declines, emotional declines, cognitive declines, lost weight because people who, they may have lost hope, they've lost the people who come in to caregive for them on a daily basis. And we see this in older adults more broadly as well. I think the warmer weather has helped, but shelter at home and stay in place, they don't have as much reserve, older adults, and people who are more isolated are finding this time extremely difficult for them. And there's fear as well. For months, older adults are the least able, for some older adults, not all of them, but to access things like virtual care or to access medical services during a difficult time where doctors' offices have been closed. And so really, we've seen this collateral damage be physical, psychological, cognitive, spiritual, and emotional among older adults. And that's been very, very difficult to see.
Are there any statistics on how many older adults in Canada have family members that are living nearby or connected to them? I know that in the US, there's a large, because people are so transient and move around, there's a large number of older adults that are distant from family members anyway, and maybe see them every so often, but now of course that's been impacted. Do we know what the Canadian circumstances? Obviously one thing that comes to my mind anyway is that, if you are able to open up for more visitation from family members, that should certainly help. But even if you were to do that, do we know what percentage of people don't even have that?
Well, it's a good question. We do know that about 75% of all our home and community care services in Canada are provided unpaid by family members or friends across the country. So, if whatever it's called in your jurisdiction, here it used to be called in Ontario CCAC, or now it's the Local Health Integration Network. If they provide 2 to 3 hours of PSW a week, an additional 9 hours is provided unpaid by a family member or friend. So the bulk of caregiving in our country is unpaid, and that existed prior to the pandemic. And traditionally, and that has fallen on the backs of women who socially are groomed in terms of gender roles to assume these caregiving responsibilities. And increasingly that gap is dividing, that gender gap between men and women, but we know that about 75% of them do. And then we know that across a lifetime, more than half of all Canadians will assume a caregiving role at some point in their life. So in terms of the precise number of individuals, we only know this in select cohorts. There are estimations about the number of caregivers that occur across the country. Whether or not the geographic, I agree to some extent, we tend to be more, we tend to remain closer to our proximal environment in Canada, whereas the States families seem to disperse more. But it's not just the geographic location in terms of assuming these roles. People have to be willing and able to perform these often very difficult tasks. And so caregiving during this time not only have people been restricted from having caregivers, particularly those who are living in care homes, but the role itself has become much more difficult as people navigate their own lives, but also how to provide care in a really challenging time as well.
What are some of the solutions that you think would be most helpful? From what would be the top three, in your mind, the top three responses to this, and from where would those responses be most suited to come from?
Yeah, so I think it's important to distinguish between those who live in homes, long-term care and retirement homes, and those who live in the community. So in long-term care homes, I actually think it's a little more clear what immediately needs to be done for homes. I think one of the more urgent priorities for families and caregivers and residents is a way to safely reintegrate visitors and family caregivers who want to get in. So there is going to be always this tension between opening up the doors more and potentially exposing homes to COVID-19, but also the quality of life of people who already have limited life expectancies and have already essentially been in lockdown for the better part of 6 months now. That's an urgent priority. We know that, and there's government study to support this, that there needs to urgently be more staffing provided to long-term care homes. There's a study that came out in July with recommendations about the minimum number of hours which were far away from meeting. And what we saw in the pandemic, and I saw firsthand, is that nursing homes which already have very tenuous staffing situations before the pandemic, some homes, more than half of their staff got sick and there was nobody to provide care to people in the homes, which led to drastic measures like the military being called into homes. And the third thing is that we need to ensure for these homes that they have access and rapid access to the expertise that they need when it comes to infection prevention and control, to personal protective equipment, and to diagnostic testing. I think we've made a lot of headway in terms of securing our personal protective equipment or PPE stockpile for these homes. Testing has moved a long way since March. I would argue that homes still feel that they're worried as they approach the fall that they may not have the direct access and expertise and personnel on site to help with some of the infection prevention and control measures. So I would say those in the nursing home setting are the three most urgent and pressing priorities. In the community-based setting, it's candidly often harder because you don't have a direct line of sight on these people all the time, and you worry about the people who are who you are missing, who are living and suffering in silence and isolation. And so I think this is where organizations like synagogues, and I know that Beth Tzedek has been doing this, but to have regular outreach and contact for those who are isolated, who need assistance with activities in their daily life, whether it's groceries, banking, even things like helping facilitate technological connection between people. I think the outreach to people who are already socially isolated, which are only going to worsen during a pandemic, those people need to be reached. I think we need to overall as well, whenever we create policy and whenever we speak, we need to always think about the ways that this may impact older adults. So I'll give you an example. Early on in the pandemic, there was the overwhelming sort of messaging that this pandemic was only going to affect or kill older people. And you saw this sort of brazen actions going on of people on spring break on beaches. And so there has been a somewhat of an ageist tone to some of the response. And we see this as well now, frankly, in terms of, if we look at the case numbers, young people are dominating the case counts at this point. A lot of them continue to ignore public health messaging and guidance. And I think some of that's driven by the fact that, at the end of the day, they know that the people who are going to be most impacted by them is probably not them. And so they have what's called an identifiable live bias, where the actions that they take are for those, reflect the lives that they most identify with, which are not only always older adults who are most isolated. And I think thirdly, we need to find a way as we move forward to not only to have a more nuanced and balanced approach to public health measures when it comes to older adults. So we can't only be focused on protecting them from COVID-19 and COVID-19 death. We need to be focused on these collateral damages that I've been speaking about as well, to make sure that there are opportunities for them to maintain their function, to maintain their physical exercise, and think about creative ways to protect them from COVID-19, but also to ensure that we are promoting health and wellness in other ways during this difficult time.
So I think about Betzedek in that regard, right? So we're a big facility, 110,000 plus square feet. But we worry with the responsibility of bringing people in and the risk of them getting sick and then passing it on to everyone else. It's, as you said, it's the default position seems to be stay isolated, but yet you have all this collateral damage. And just to put it in context, and I'm planning on talking about this issue specifically on Yom Kippur, because one of the most important pieces of the High Holiday Liturgy comes from Shema Kolenu towards the end of Musaf, where we read, Al tashlichenu le'et zikna, kichlot kochenu al tazvenu. Don't forsake us when our strength begins to fail, don't forsake us in our old age. It literally means don't cast us out when we get older and our strength begins to fail. You, God, have been our hope in all our days through joy and sorrow, and be with us to the end, our comforter in life's tomorrow. I think that's really, it's a powerful message that relates to this topic. And help me understand what are the ways in which a congregation like Betzedek, which does struggle exactly with that tension. We used to, before the pandemic, every Thursday we'd have a games day, and there'd be 150 to 200 people here, mostly single women, a couple men looking to meet single women. But they'd come, they'd play canasta and mahjong, and they would have snacks. And what I realized immediately is that it wasn't about the games. They weren't coming for the games. They were coming for the social, for being together. And yet now we can't seem to do that. What can we do?
Yeah, I mean, this is tough. I mean, I think the default response that everyone has said is leverage technology, right? Which can be done for some people, but we have to recognize older adults have higher prevalence of sensory impairment. They have higher prevalence of cognitive impairment. And some of them candidly have poor technological literacy, right? So you may carve out a section where virtual games may work, virtual conversations, virtual check-ins may work. But you always have to keep in mind that segment where it will not work. And then, what are the sorts of things you can do for that segment of the population that cannot participate in these things? And again, making use of the outdoors, particularly at this time, I think is something that's really should be valued. One of the things that's actually selling out across the country are heating lamps, because people are recognizing that when they gather in the coming months, a lot of it may be outdoors. So are there activities that traditionally were done indoors that can be moved outdoors? And thankfully we're getting over most of the heat waves, but we have the cold fronts that are going to be approaching us. And then, are there ways to help people feel that they still are part of a community and still part of something greater, even as we are physically distanced during this time? And I've seen all sorts of creative responses from different places across the world, whether that's creating a radio broadcast or a television broadcast that's specific to a community to provide people with updates. And I know Betzedek has done some of these things or related concepts. But how can you replace some of that in-person physical interaction with something that still makes people feel connected? And then, again, I think people have a fear of abandonment and aloneness and isolation. And, sometimes it's a helpline or, just someone for them to talk to, so they feel that there is some backup system in their lives when people may not have that. And I think that's really that social security that people are craving and yearning during these difficult times.
Um, okay. Thank you, Nathan. I think this is a topic we're going to have to come back to.
Yes.
I think it's really, really important. I wanna thank you for being such a strong advocate and so clear in your ability to describe what the problem is, but also to identify potential solutions and responses. And I also appreciate the challenge to sacred communities like Beth Tzedec to continue to strive to do that. We are, as you mentioned, we are reaching out to members of the congregation. We've identified those that are lonely. We've identified those that need more resources in terms of helping with shopping and so forth and so on. And we've done our best, both as partners with UJA Federation, but also for those for whom UJA doesn't work, because specifically people that have special dietary needs, like people that are diabetic that need specific things. UGA doesn't do that kind of personal shopping, but we've been able to do that for some people. And we are endeavoring to call people, especially those that we know that have said to us, I just appreciate a call from somebody every week, just to say hi and to deal with those issues of loneliness. There's a lot of that out there. If you're watching and you happen to be someone who would appreciate those calls, please let us know. Pick up the phone and call either me or Clara Ram or Yaakov Fruchter or Rabbi Fire Batson, or send an email if you can to any one of us. You can find our emails on our websites. And we're happy to make sure that someone in the congregation will call you on a regular basis. And even more importantly, if you're someone who has some free time and you'd like to pick up the phone and do a mitzvah and just chat with somebody who's looking for people to chat with, come let us know who you are as well. Because this mitzvah is one, as you heard, is very, very important for the overall well-being of the older adults within our community. And we certainly at Beth Tzedec are going to continue to try to respond to the call of the Machzor and to not to cast our older adults at the time of their age giving way to them. So that's certainly what our commitments are, and we'll hear more about this on the High Holy Days. As I said, tune in on Yom Kippur. I'm intending this to be my sermon for that morning. Next week, join us as Ambassador Dan Shapiro, the former U.S. ambassador to Israel, and before that he was a national security advisor to President Obama. Now he participates in a think tank and has been very, very involved in the Democratic Party, especially in the creation of the platform as it relates to foreign policy and Middle East issues, specifically in and around U.S. relationships for Israel. We know that the U.S., the Democratic Party, as well as the Republican Party, continue to be very strong supporters of Israel, but circumstances are changing in both parties. And so you can join us as Ambassador Shapiro tells us a little bit about what's going on in the Democratic Party in terms of its platform vis-a-vis Israel, but we'll also have an opportunity to talk about things that are happening in Israel, like the recent peace agreement with the United Arab Emirates, as well as the ongoing challenges of peace with the Palestinians and the existential threat still posed by Iran. So a lot to talk about in 30 minutes, but that's next week, 12:30. Join us for conversations over coffee. Nathan, thank you again. This was really, really important. I appreciate your taking the time, and we'll see you all. Goodbye.
Thanks for having me.